The afternoon of the 10th of April, 1834 started like any other spring day in New Orleans' French Quarter. The air hung thick with humidity and the scent of magnolia blossoms. But as smoke began to pour from the windows of the elegant mansion at 1140 Royal Street, neighbors rushed to help what they assumed was a family in distress. What they discovered would shatter their understanding of evil itself. When firefighters broke down the doors to reach the upper floors, they expected to find furniture and belongings. Instead, they found human beings. 7 enslaved people were chained to the walls of the attic, their bodies bearing evidence of unspeakable cruelty. Some hung by spiked iron collars, others had their limbs stretched and torn, and several were missing body parts entirely. The woman responsible for this chamber of horrors was not some deranged stranger lurking in the shadows. She was Madame Delphine LaLaurie, respected socialite, charitable church member, and pillar of New Orleans high society. For years, she had hidden her true nature behind silk gowns and dinner parties, while systematically torturing human beings in her own home. This is the story of how one woman's evil could hide in plain sight, protected by wealth, status, and a society that turned away from the suffering of the enslaved. Before we dive into this disturbing true story, if you're interested in more cases like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Now, let's go back to the beginning to understand how a woman could become capable of such evil. Marie Delphine McCarty was born around 1787 in New Orleans, during a time when the city was a melting pot of cultures, languages, and contradictions. Her father was Bartholomew Louis McCarty, an Irish gentleman who had established himself in Louisiana society, and her mother, Marie Jean Liable, was a French woman from a prominent Creole family. Growing up in the Spanish colonial period, young Delphine was raised in a world where owning human beings was not just legal, but expected among families of her social standing. The McCarty family was well established in New Orleans society, and from birth, Delphine was destined for a life of privilege and social prominence. But privilege in early 19th century New Orleans came with a particular kind of power, the power of life and death over enslaved people. And for Delphine, this power would become an addiction more dangerous than any drug. The New Orleans of Delphine's youth was a city unlike anywhere else in America. French, Spanish, and American influences blended together in a unique cultural landscape where Creole society maintained its own rules and traditions. Wealthy families like the McCartys moved in exclusive circles, attending elaborate balls, hosting dinner parties, and maintaining their status through careful marriages and social connections. Education for young women of Delphine's class focused on the social graces, French language, music, dancing, and the art of managing a household. But household management in New Orleans society meant controlling enslaved people, and from a young age, Delphine would have been taught to view enslaved people as property rather than human beings. This early conditioning was crucial in shaping the woman Delphine would become. In a society that normalized the ownership of human beings, the seeds of cruelty could take root and grow largely unnoticed until they became something monstrous. At 19 years old, Delphine married her first husband, Don Ramon de Lopez y Angulo, a Spanish officer stationed in New Orleans. The marriage was typical of unions among the Creole elite, arranged to strengthen social and financial ties between prominent families. Don Ramon was significantly older than his teenage bride, and their relationship was more business arrangement than romance. The marriage was brief but significant. Don Ramon died in 1804, leaving Delphine a widow at just 21 years old. But rather than devastate her, this loss seemed to awaken something in the young woman. For the first time in her life, she had control. Control over property, control over money, and most importantly, control over the enslaved people who worked her household. Historical records from this period are sparse, but what emerges is a picture of a woman who was already showing signs of cruelty toward those in her power. Neighbors later recalled that servants in Delphine's household seemed unusually fearful, and that there were whispers about her harsh treatment of enslaved people even during her first marriage. In 1808, Delphine married again, this time to Jean Blanche, a prominent banker and politician. Blanc was a man of considerable wealth and influence, and their marriage elevated Delphine's social status even further. Together, they had 4 children, and Delphine seemed to settle into the role of the perfect Creole wife and mother. But behind the facade of domestic bliss, something dark was growing. Servants began disappearing from the Blanc household, and those who remained showed signs of mistreatment that couldn't be explained away by normal household discipline. When Jean Blanc died in 1816, Delphine was once again a widow, but this time she was a wealthy widow, with extensive property holdings and a large number of enslaved people under her control. The pattern was becoming clear. Each time Delphine gained more power and independence, the treatment of those under her control became more severe. It was as if the deaths of her husbands had removed the last restraints on her behavior, allowing her true nature to emerge. In 1825, Delphine married for the third and final time. Her new husband was Dr. Louis LaLaurie, a much younger man who seemed content to let his wife manage their household affairs. This marriage would prove to be the most significant of Delphine's life, not because of any great love, but because it gave her the perfect cover for her crimes. Dr. LaLaurie was a respected physician in New Orleans society, and his medical knowledge may have influenced the increasingly sophisticated nature of his wife's cruelty. More importantly, his status as a doctor provided explanations for the screams and strange odor that sometimes emanated from their Royal Street mansion. The LaLaurie mansion was a testament to the family's wealth and status. Located in the heart of the French Quarter, the three-story building was elegantly appointed with the finest furnishings money could buy. The main floors showcased imported furniture, crystal chandeliers, and artwork that reflected the family's refined taste and social position. But it was the hidden spaces of the mansion that told the real story of what happened there. The attic, the basement, and various rooms throughout the house were converted into what can only be described as torture chambers. Here, away from the eyes of society, Delphine could indulge her darkest impulses without fear of discovery. The enslaved people who worked in the LaLaurie household lived in constant terror. Those who survived later described a woman who seemed to take pleasure in inflicting pain, who would devise elaborate punishments for the smallest infractions, and who treated human beings as if they were objects to be experimented upon. Delphine's cruelty was not random or impulsive, it was systematic and calculated. She kept detailed records of her punishments, almost as if she were conducting scientific experiments on human suffering. The medical knowledge gained from her husband's profession may have influenced these horrific experiments, as survivors described procedures that seemed designed to inflict maximum pain while keeping victims alive. What made Delphine LaLaurie so dangerous was not just her cruelty, but her ability to hide it behind a facade of respectability. To the outside world, she was the perfect example of Southern womanhood. Charitable, devout, and gracious, she attended church regularly, participated in social functions, and maintained friendships with the most prominent families in New Orleans. This public persona provided the perfect cover for her private crimes. When neighbors occasionally heard screams from the LaLaurie mansion, they were easily dismissed as the sounds of necessary discipline. When enslaved people disappeared from the household, it was assumed they had been sold or had run away. The social order of antebellum New Orleans made it easy for those in power to abuse those without power, and Delphine took full advantage of this system. Her position in society also provided her with a network of protection. Fellow members of the social elite were reluctant to believe ill of someone from their own class. And even when evidence of abuse emerged, it was often dismissed or explained away. The enslaved people who were her victims had no legal recourse and no one to turn to for help. Delphine understood the power of reputation and worked carefully to maintain hers. She made strategic charitable donations, hosted elaborate parties for influential guests, and always presented herself as the epitome of refined Southern femininity. This carefully constructed image would serve her well for nearly a decade, allowing her to continue her crimes with virtual impunity. But even the most carefully constructed facade can crack under pressure, and by the early 1832, whispers about the LaLaurie household were beginning to spread through New Orleans society. The first public hint that something was seriously wrong at the LaLaurie mansion came in 1833, when a young enslaved girl named Leah fell to her death from the mansion's roof. According to witnesses, the child had been chased to the roof by Delphine herself, who was wielding a whip and shouting threats. Rather than being seen as a tragedy, Leah's death was treated as a minor scandal. The authorities fined Delphine for the death, but the punishment was minimal, a small fine, and a requirement that she sell 9 of her enslaved people. Even this modest penalty was easily circumvented, as Delphine arranged for relatives to purchase the people and then immediately sell them back to her. The incident should have been a warning sign, but New Orleans society was too invested in maintaining the status quo to investigate further. Delphine's wealth and social position continued to protect her, and life in the French Quarter continued as normal. However, the incident had planted seeds of suspicion in the minds of some neighbors. They began to pay closer attention to the comings and goings at the LaLaurie mansion, and what they observed was troubling. Enslaved people who entered the house seemed to disappear, and those who remained appeared malnourished and terrified. Strange odor began to emanate from the mansion, particularly from the upper floors and basement areas. Neighbors reported hearing screams and other disturbing sounds, especially at night. When questioned, the LaLauries explained these disturbances as necessary discipline or medical procedures being performed by Dr. LaLaurie. The couple's explanations were accepted because they fit with the social expectations of the time. Wealthy families were expected to maintain strict discipline among their enslaved people, and Dr. LaLaurie's medical practice provided a reasonable explanation for unusual sounds and smells. But for those paying close attention, the pattern was becoming clear. Something terrible was happening at 1140 Royal Street, and it was only a matter of time before the truth would be revealed. On the morning of the 10th of April, 1834, an enslaved woman named Leah, not the same girl who had died the previous year, made a desperate decision that would expose the full extent of Delphine LaLaurie's crimes. Chained to the stove in the mansion's kitchen, she deliberately set fire to the building, preferring to risk death by fire rather than endure continued torture at the hands of her owner. The fire spread quickly through the mansion, and neighbors rushed to help fight the flames and rescue the inhabitants. But when they arrived, they found the LaLauries strangely reluctant to accept assistance. The couple claimed that the fire was under control and that no help was needed, but the smoke pouring from the windows told a different story. Frustrated by the LaLauries' refusal to cooperate, neighbors and firefighters forced their way into the building. What they found on the ground floor was disturbing enough. The enslaved woman who had started the fire was chained to the stove, unable to escape, even if the flames had reached her. But the real horror lay in the upper floors of the mansion. When rescuers broke down the doors to the attic, they discovered a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 7 enslaved people were found chained to the walls and floors, their bodies bearing evidence of prolonged torture and mutilation. Some hung by spiked iron collars, others had their limbs stretched and torn, and several were missing body parts entirely. The victims were both men and women, ranging in age from young adults to elderly. All showed signs of having been subjected to systematic torture over an extended period. Some had been the subjects of what appeared to be medical experiments, with holes drilled in their skulls and limbs broken and reset in unnatural positions. The scene was so horrific that several of the rescuers became physically ill. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the French Quarter, and within hours an angry crowd had gathered outside the LaLaurie mansion. News of the discovery at the LaLaurie mansion spread through New Orleans like wildfire. The city's newspapers published detailed accounts of what rescuers had found, and public outrage grew with each revelation. The New Orleans Bee newspaper reported that 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, were seen suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. The public response was swift and violent. A mob of angry citizens gathered outside the mansion, demanding justice for the victims and punishment for the perpetrators. The crowd grew larger and more agitated as the day wore on, with many calling for the LaLauries to be handed over for immediate punishment. But Delphine LaLaurie was not about to face justice. Recognizing that her crimes had finally been exposed, she made immediate plans to flee the city. With the help of loyal servants and possibly some remaining allies among the social elite, she managed to escape from the mansion before the mob could reach her. LaLaurie's house was subsequently sacked by an outraged mob of New Orleans citizens. She escaped to France with her family. The angry crowd destroyed much of the mansion's contents, but their primary target had already slipped away. The discovery at the LaLaurie mansion sent shockwaves through New Orleans society. For the first time, the city's elite were forced to confront the reality of what could happen when wealth and power were combined with unchecked cruelty. The case challenged the social order that had protected Delphine for so long and forced uncomfortable questions about how such horrors could have been allowed to continue. But even as the city reeled from the revelations, there was a recognition that justice would be difficult to achieve. Delphine LaLaurie had escaped, and the legal system of the time provided little recourse for crimes against enslaved people. The victims who had survived the ordeal faced an uncertain future, and the perpetrator was beyond the reach of American law. In the aftermath of the fire, authorities began a more thorough investigation of the LaLaurie mansion and the crimes that had been committed there. What they discovered painted an even more disturbing picture of the systematic torture and murder that had taken place over several years. The mansion's upper floors and basement areas had been converted into elaborate torture chambers, equipped with restraints, medical instruments, and other devices designed to inflict pain. Investigators found evidence that suggested the torture had been ongoing for years, with new victims regularly replacing those who had died from their injuries. The medical nature of many of the tortures suggested that Dr. LaLaurie had been involved in, or at least aware of, his wife's crimes. The use of surgical instruments and the apparent experimentation on human subjects pointed to someone with medical knowledge and access to professional equipment. But Dr. LaLaurie had fled with his wife, leaving behind only questions about his level of involvement in the crimes. Some evidence suggested he had been a willing participant, while other accounts portrayed him as a weak man, dominated by his wife's stronger personality. The investigation also revealed that the LaLaurie household had been the subject of complaints and suspicions for years, but that these concerns had been ignored or dismissed by authorities. The couple's social position and wealth had provided them with protection that allowed their crimes to continue unchecked. Records showed that numerous enslaved people had died or disappeared from the LaLaurie household over the years, but these deaths had been attributed to natural causes or explained away as runaways. The true scope of the couple's crimes would likely never be fully known, as many victims had been killed and their bodies disposed of in ways that left no trace. Delphine LaLaurie's escape from New Orleans was as carefully planned as her crimes had been systematic. With the help of remaining allies and a network of social connections, she managed to flee the city before authorities could arrest her. She escaped to France with her family. The escape was facilitated by the same social networks that had protected her for years. Wealthy families in New Orleans maintained connections with relatives and business associates in Europe, providing ready-made escape routes for those who needed to leave the country quickly. Some accounts suggest that Delphine had been planning her escape even before the fire, recognizing that her crimes were becoming increasingly difficult to hide. The fire and discovery of the torture chambers may have simply accelerated a timeline that was already in motion. Once in France, Delphine LaLaurie seemed to disappear from historical records. The rest of Madame LaLaurie's life is not well documented. It is thought she spent the rest of her days in France. Some accounts suggest she lived quietly in Paris, while others claim she eventually returned to New Orleans in secret. The mystery surrounding her final years has only added to her legend. Without a clear resolution to her story, Delphine LaLaurie became a figure of both horror and fascination, her crimes remembered long after her death. Her escape also meant that she never faced justice for her crimes. The victims who survived her torture would never see their tormentor punished, and the families of those who died would never receive closure. In a legal system that provided little protection for enslaved people, Delphine LaLaurie's escape represented the ultimate failure of justice. The discovery of the horrors at the LaLaurie mansion had a profound impact on New Orleans society and the broader conversation about slavery in America. For the first time, the extreme cruelty that was possible within the system of slavery was exposed to public scrutiny, forcing uncomfortable questions about the nature of power and its abuse. The case challenged the romanticized image of Southern slavery that many white Americans preferred to maintain. The idea that enslaved people were treated as part of the family was difficult to sustain when confronted with evidence of systematic torture and murder. The LaLaurie case became a powerful argument for abolitionists who sought to expose the inherent cruelty of slavery. But the case also revealed the limitations of the legal system in protecting the most vulnerable members of society. Delphine LaLaurie's wealth and social position had allowed her to commit horrific crimes with impunity for years, and even after her crimes were exposed, she was able to escape justice entirely. The mansion itself became a symbol of the horrors that had taken place there. Today, The house is still standing. It is considered the most haunted building in all of New Orleans. The building changed hands multiple times over the years, with many owners reporting strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena. The LaLaurie case also contributed to a growing awareness of the psychological damage that slavery inflicted on both victims and perpetrators. Delphine's crimes were not just acts of cruelty, but symptoms of a system that dehumanized both enslaved people and their owners. The case became a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of absolute power over other human beings. An epitaph plate declaring her death was found in New Orleans in 1873. Whether Delphine LaLaurie actually returned to New Orleans, or whether this was simply a symbolic gesture, remains a mystery. But her legacy was already firmly established, not as the refined Southern belle she had pretended to be, but as one of America's most notorious killers. The story of Delphine LaLaurie serves as a powerful reminder of how evil can hide behind a facade of respectability and social status. Her crimes were made possible not just by her own twisted psychology, but by a system that enabled and protected her abuse of power. The enslaved people who suffered and died at her hands were victims not just of her individual cruelty, but of a society that denied their humanity and legal protection. Today, the LaLaurie Mansion stands as a monument to both the horrors of slavery and the importance of remembering difficult truths about our past. The story of what happened there continues to fascinate and horrify new generations, serving as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the need for vigilance in protecting the vulnerable. Delphine LaLaurie's story reminds us that monsters are not always strangers lurking in the shadows. Sometimes the greatest evil comes from those who walk among us, hidden behind masks of respectability and social acceptance. Her crimes were a product of her time and place, but the capacity for such evil exists in every generation, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. The victims of Delphine LaLaurie deserved better than the society that failed to protect them. Their suffering was real, their pain was immense, and their stories deserve to be remembered, not as entertainment, but as a solemn reminder of our responsibility to protect the vulnerable and ensure that such horrors never happen again. Thanks for watching. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories like this one.